Anyone who follows the news even a little knows that China and the United States are equals in the global economy. Some believe that Beijing has already surpassed Washington. Some argue that the coronavirus has hit the Celestial Empire's economy, and America will be leading for a while still. In any case, if someone had told these people 60 years ago that impoverished post-revolutionary China would become one of the world's two key giants, they would have simply laughed it off. How did China become a leader in almost all sectors, who pushed it to the top, and who will maintain the lead in the future? In this episode, the most important and interesting aspects of the China-America rivalry. Not every eye sees an enemy. This proverb very accurately describes the history of China's emergence as we know it today. Money is the main element of influence in the modern world. Beginning in 1944, the world's financial power was centered in the United States. During the post-war recovery period, the United States of America used its creditor position to influence the trade blocs of Great Britain and France. Recovery loans were issued in exchange for importing American goods and granting Washington veto rights in international organizations. This system was supported by fixed exchange rates in gold. But the increase in expenditures on the military-industrial complex, especially during the Cold War, and a reduction in the trade balance, led to a budget deficit in the United States of America. The deficit was largely linked to military expenditures abroad. However, Americans did not want to come out of the Cold War as losers. As American allies exchanged their dollars for gold, the dollar's convertibility became unstable. The volume of dollars in circulation exceeded the established norms of gold reserves, which led to a difficult situation. In 1971, the Nixon administration decided to detach the dollar from gold and devalue it by 10%. This was a cunning geopolitical move. Now, foreign central banks could no longer exchange dollars for gold, losing control over the U.S. economy in this way. At the same time, they could not abandon the dollar as it could lead to a deficit in their dollar reserves. As a result, they were forced to invest dollars in U.S. Treasury bonds at interest. So, in essence, they recognized the dominance of the dollar. Now it became the world currency independent of the gold standard, which gave Washington financial freedom for military needs abroad. The dollar, sent abroad, returned through foreign central banks in the form of treasury bills, creating an endless cycle and essentially acting as a perpetual engine in the economy. It was possible to financially support any military plans. Why not deploy military bases around the world if the expended resources came back as payments for defense services? Throughout all this time, the threat of a possible international currency crisis prevented other countries from simply exposing and renouncing the American strategy. As a result, the states' status as a major debtor weakened them, but also strengthened their influence. The ability to earn dollars in such a cunning way freed them from strict economic discipline, rules they themselves created through the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank for other countries with dollar debts. The deal of 1974 with Saudi Arabia further strengthened their position. The Arabs sold oil for dollars and invested the proceeds in U.S. Treasury bonds. In conjunction with America's dominance in agriculture, this meant that unilateral dollar sanctions could deprive many countries, especially those dependent on trade with the states, of the ability to import food and energy resources. Naturally, not everyone liked such a smooth scheme, but no one was able to take any serious steps. The Americans have dug their own grave. Specifically, companies from the United States of America transferred a large amount of money and investments to rapidly growing China. It was the states that became the godfather of the Chinese economic miracle. After the Soviet-Chinese armed conflict on the Damansky Island in 969, they mistakenly thought in Washington that a new ally had appeared in the battle against the Soviets. By 1970, a multi-billion-dollar concept, opening of China, was already developed by the National Security Advisor to the United States President, Henry Kissinger. President Jimmy Carter later lobbied for the interests of developing Beijing's economy. In China, Deng Xiaoping himself was the driving force in attracting direct foreign investments, blessing the financial flow with the famous phrase, "It doesn't matter what color the cat is, black or white." A good cat is the one that catches mice. China has announced a new foreign policy course of external openness, the goal of which was to attract direct foreign investment. Moreover, it meant not just ordinary investments, but the creation from scratch of high-tech joint ventures, joint projects for the exploration and development of natural resources, compensatory deals, which envisaged the direct supply of equipment, technologies, technical and expert personnel by foreign companies, so both money and people and technologies. The American economy continued to strengthen despite emerging crises to a significant extent thanks to savvy politics and strategic alliances. During this time, the global economic scene started to change, and the role of technology became increasingly important. The scale and method of aiding China sometimes led to strategic losses for the United States of America, despite the benefits. Here's a vivid example. There was a plant in California for rare earth metals, which Americans considered harmful to their ecology. They decided to dismantle it, gave it to China, and then a new plant was built in the vast Bayan Obo deposit. China employs around 20,000 people and has quintupled these metals' production in 12 years. And in 12 years, China has increased the production of these metals five-fold, taking 93% of the global market under control. This has allowed China to manipulate prices, which has become a major problem for the US and other countries. Firstly, thanks to cheap labor and resources, China drove down prices, driving competitors out of the game. Then, in the 2010 year, it cut exports sharply, which drastically raised prices for components for high-tech goods, sometimes by hundreds, if not thousands, of percent. Now, rare earth metals are shipped for processing to Baogan from all over the world. And this is already not just a huge profit, but a powerful geopolitical tool. Beijing can effectively halt production of high-tech and even military products worldwide. China has fully taken advantage of the favorable political and economic atmosphere of the 80s. Initially, it became a global factory of consumer goods. Then, gathering financial and production forces, it identified the most promising areas of industrial production and rushed into microelectronics, machine building, aviation, and astronautics. Since the beginning of the mouse hunt with an American cat, that is, since the 80s, almost 400,000 new enterprises have been built in China from scratch. If in the same 80s, at current prices, the industry produced products for 34 trillion of the same dollars, then in 2014, for 4 trillion of the same dollars. In the world, the share of Chinese industry increased from 3 to 25%. As a result of financial investments, the policies of NUTA and WIP in the hands of the Communist Party, and of course the hard work of the Chinese themselves. The growth of the celestial economy has amazed the entire world, from 1998 to 2010, by 10%, from 2001 to 2014, 9 whole and 0.2%. The volume of gross domestic product from 1978 to 2014 increased 2016 times. In the year 2019, the gross regional product in one of the most developed provinces, Guangdong, exceeded the gross domestic product of the whole of Russia. In the year 2020, the Chinese gross domestic product crossed the mystical plank into 100 trillion yuan. According to data for the year 2020, the volume of American-Chinese trade amounted to $588 billion. The share of Sino-American trade accounts for 12 and 6% of the volume of China's foreign trade. China is the largest trading partner of the United States of America, and for the United States of America, China is the largest export market and the third largest trading partner after the Association of Southeast Asian Nations and the European Union. The U.S. trade deficit with China is already exceeding $330 billion. In the United States of America, it is believed that China is deliberately devaluing the yuan against the dollar to expand its goods abroad. While the yuan's exchange rate against the dollar rose after China's accession to the World Trade Organization in the early 2000s, the reverse process has been happening in recent years. These two factors, the devaluation of the yuan and the growing U.S. trade deficit with China, have led to a trade war between the two countries, which has now morphed into a political one. Gaining economic power, China began to invest all around itself, then extended its influence to all continents, and the yuan became a global currency. To understand the scale of China's grand economy, one can look at the impressive sizes of the economies of the country's cities. Have you heard about such cities as Ji, Xia, Zhuan, Wuxi, Changsha, Su, Zhou, Ningbo, Foshan, or Yantai? And millions of people live there, while the gross domestic product of these cities is comparable to the gross domestic product of entire countries. For example, Shenzhen's gross domestic product is on par in purchasing power. $1 billion, close to the gross domestic product of Sweden. And if you consider that these cities are not isolated but form whole megalopolises, the figures become even more impressive. In the Yangtze River Delta, you find Shanghai, Suzhou, Nanjing, Hangzhou, Wuxi, Ningbo, and Jiaxing. Their combined gross domestic product is a full $262 trillion, equivalent to Italy's economy. The cities of Hong Kong, Guangzhou, Shenzhen, Foshan, Dongguan, Jiangmen, Zhongshan, Huizhou, and Macau make up the Pearl River Delta. Their combined gross domestic product there equals $189 trillion. That is, more than the gross domestic product of South Korea. And finally, the Beijing-Tianjin region, with a combined gross domestic product of $114 trillion, which is comparable to Australia. This mega-region includes the two largest cities in northern China, Beijing and Tianjin. In 2012, China ranked first in the number of scientific developments in many key technological fields. This was shown by a study by the Australian Institute of Strategic Policy. The critical technology tracker compiled by them shows that China leads in 37 out of 44 research areas, from the creation of nanomaterials and robotics to advanced radio frequency communications, defense, and space technologies. In particular, in the last 5 years, Chinese scientists have produced 49% of the most important scientific works on modern aviation engines, including hypersonic engines for rockets. 7 out of 10 scientific centers leading in developments in this field are located in the country. In second place in the technology race are the states, which maintain leadership in 8 areas, including quantum computing and vaccine development. The rest of the countries lag behind significantly. India and Great Britain most often make it into the top 5 in terms of the number of scientific publications, less often South Korea, Germany, Australia, Italy. As for Russia, it only made it into the top 5 in one area: modern explosives and energy materials. The authors of the study note that many scientific publications are released in Russia, but only a negligible portion of them end up being among the most cited. At the end of the third decade, China overtook Japan in car exports. China's main growth was due to the increased demand for cars with gasoline engines from Russia, which faced sanctions from European, Japanese, and Korean car manufacturers. Interest in Chinese cars has also grown in Mexico. However, in Russia, car lovers have encountered some problems. One of the main absences is the unification of components. At the same time, European and Japanese brands strictly follow the principles of unification, and dozens of factories around the world produce the same parts. The problem is that China lacks an internal industry standard. For example, the muffler on your car was made by one factory. After a year, the muffler needed to be replaced, but in that time, the manufacturer had also changed. Now it's produced by a different company, and it no longer fits your car. If you are in China itself, the problem can be solved quickly, but repairs abroad may take a long time. The video of how the Chinese Chang'an failed to handle Russian frosts at -25 degrees went viral. His gas pedal fell off because it was made of plastic. In the same 23rd year, the Chinese currency took second place among the most popular currencies in trade calculations through the International System of Financial Messages, displacing the euro to third place. The American dollar is in first place, followed by the Japanese yen, the Saudi riyal, the Indonesian rupiah, the Thai baht, the United Arab Emirates dirham, the Vietnamese dong, and the British pound sterling. Russia has switched to trading with China in yuan, and moreover, more than 2/3 of all trade transactions are carried out in national currencies. This figure is expected to rise. For instance, The largest company in most cases pays for goods transported from China to Russia in yuan, remaining in dollars. Latin America is also gradually moving away from dollar transactions with China, switching to the Chinese currency. And Brazil has signed an agreement with China about using cashless yuan payments. This greatly streamlines trade between the countries. Argentina, for example, has emulated Brazil. The government announced that it will begin paying for Chinese imports in Chinese currency units, not US dollars. This allows the Argentinian central bank to conserve its dollar reserves, which are necessary for debt repayment and financing imports. Bolivia plans to join these countries. Its president, Luis Arce, has announced readiness to use the yuan in international trade. He added that this might become a trend throughout Latin America. And so we smoothly moved into the underbrush of America in 2,000 years. United States President George Bush said, "Those who ignore Latin America don't fully understand America, and those who ignore our hemisphere don't fully understand American interests." Our government, for example, was very rightly indifferent to such a country as Kosovo. But in Colombia, there are more refugees. America was very rightly indifferent to the situation in Kuwait. But in Venezuela, we get much more oil. America is right, greeting trade with China. But we export almost the same to Brazil. Bush would likely be very surprised that 24 years later, his speech was taken more seriously in Beijing than in Washington. This is what the salt flats of Uyuni look like, where the largest lithium deposits in the world are concentrated, part of the so-called lithium triangle, which is located between Bolivia, Chile, and Argentina. This region contains about 70% of the world's lithium reserves. At present, the situation seems stable. However, the sources of lithium in this region will soon be depleted. Lithium is a key material for the development of renewable energy technologies. Therefore, in a few decades, these salt flats could be catastrophically depleted. The biggest investors in the lithium triangle are Chinese companies that own significant shares in this region. But the lithium triangle is just an example. China is actively expanding its presence in this region, investing not only financially, but also participating in construction projects and space programs. Opening up Asia and Africa, Beijing is gradually opening its economic can opener to South America. Over the last 2 decades, China's trade with Latin America has grown by 26 times, and by 2035, it is expected that the trade volume will reach $700 billion. This dynamics clearly demonstrates the United States' loss of influence in a region that has long been considered their most unequivocal sphere of influence. In the video about Colombia, we mentioned that the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics spread its influence to South America. What was the cost of the capture of government buildings by the M19 communist movement? But after the fall of the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, additional influence over South America was gained by other formal communists, the Chinese. You might wonder, if we spoke about the Chinese influence in Asia, Africa, and even South America, then what about Russia? What relations do we have with the heavenly? The situation in this matter is complex. We talked about this in a special video that is available on our closed Telegram channel. Subscribe and you will have access to exclusive materials. There is already a video about illegal gypsy boxing and a device setup video. And now there are also Russian-Chinese relations. Everyone knows how harsh the regimes can be and just how distinct personalities are in South America, like drug baron Escobar in Colombia, who blew up planes for the sake of power, or Pinochet, who gave shooting orders in Chile. But despite the crime, drug trafficking, and other problems, South America remains a good place for business. The continent is known for its developed agriculture, livestock, forestry, fishing, colored metals, valuable minerals, hydrocarbons, and hydropower. The same resource curse that is attributed to Russia is present throughout South America. Much of the local infrastructure is based on export, as a result of which the internal markets are in decline. The internal economy of this region suffers from undeveloped infrastructure and a lack of skilled labor. For China, South America represents a unique place for another reason. It's a region with a rich history of authoritarianism, just like in China itself. When Beijing makes deals, It prefers long-term contracts, especially with state-owned enterprises, considering them more reliable investments. Moreover, most South American governments are presidential systems where the president is the head of the executive power. This means that Chinese politicians don't need to overcome multi-level bureaucracy. Instead, they can negotiate directly with the head of state. From the experience of Africa, we've already seen that whether the country is authoritarian or democratic, China is just as interested if they have economic interests in Beijing. He just wants to do business, and business is going well. Today, China is the largest trading partner of South America. And for Chile, trade with China makes up a significant portion of the total trade volume. Brazil and Peru each contribute 8%, Uruguay 20%, Ecuador 19%, Colombia, and Paraguay 8% each, while Bolivia and Argentina account for 14% each. But Venezuela has become China's main trading partner. The local government has taken on 17 loans totaling $62 billion. According to economists, a large amount of Chinese investments in Venezuela's oil sector has resulted in loans so substantial that the country has lost its economic independence. In the year 2008, using its lobbying influence in Venezuela, China joined the Inter-American Development Bank, and a year later, the Caribbean Development Bank, gaining member status with voting rights. All of Latin America and the Caribbean countries are members of these banks. From these banks, projects of any complexity in the region can be financed, and, more importantly, state corporations can be credited. And since that very year of 2008, China's tentacles have reached into the region's economy. The Chinese provided credits to Ecuador for a total sum of more than $18 billion for various infrastructure projects, including the construction of the Coca-Codo-Sinclair hydroelectric station. The gas doesn't look so monstrous, unlike the figures that had to be paid. The Bank of China loan for the construction of the dam amounts to $170 billion. With a rate of 7% over 15 years, that makes $125 million a year, just in interest. Ecuador services its debt to China by providing China with oil at a discount, and today, China imports 80% of oil produced in Ecuador. The hydroelectric power station was opened by Xi Jinping 7 years ago. And last year, the Ecuadorian media wrote that the dam was covered with thousands of cracks. In Bolivia, state companies signed an agreement with a Chinese corporation to develop and mine lithium deposits for more than $1 billion. And this industry promises to grow tenfold in the coming years. In Chile, China has invested $30 billion, operating along the same lines as in Africa, acquiring shares in local power grids, medical institutions, highways, and railways. In Brazil, the authorities have taken more than a dozen loans totaling $30 billion, primarily for projects in the electricity and oil and gas operations sectors. In recent years, China has shifted focus to logistics and technology. For example, in 2017, a Chinese conglomerate acquired 80% of Paranagua Port, the largest commercial port in Brazil. And in 2012, the Chinese shared something without which modern Chinese cities are unimaginable: companies. And they shared surveillance cameras with facial recognition technology. The most densely populated city in Brazil is São Paulo. This massive city ranks fourth in the list of the world's largest cities. The implications of such cameras, beyond security, need no explanation. Argentina has 13 unpaid loans totaling $17 billion. Chinese companies are actively involved in various sectors of local industry, particularly in construction, mining, and agriculture. However, the current $17 billion are at risk of doubling. This is because Argentina in 2012 faced yet another financial crisis, of which there have been more in this country than anywhere else in the world. And this time, Argentina threatened to sign an investment agreement with China for almost $14 billion. Thus, by controlling the financial flows across South America, China has crawled into what is called the United States of America's underbelly. But it's not just about money. Beijing is also actively working to strengthen its military influence. In Peru, not far from the capital Lima, a Peruvian military company is building a deep-sea port in the city of Chancay. This port could quickly be re-equipped from civilian purposes to military ones. The project, worth a whopping $100 billion, will establish a direct route with China. Usually, ships from South America to Asia take over 45 days, but the new project will reduce the travel time for ships to just 10 days. In the south of Argentina, there is a station that is part of China's deep space network for interplanetary flights and space apparatus. This base allows China to perform aerospace monitoring and relay signals over long distances. A similar situation is in Venezuela, where there is the El Sombrero space base, from which China launches satellites into orbit along trajectories that are inaccessible from its own territory. And in 2005 years, China deployed several ground-based control stations that track thousands of satellites and objects in Earth's orbit. In total, 11 ground control stations have been set up in South America and belong to China. Their exact purpose and capabilities are unknown. However, it is assumed they could be utilized for both scientific and military purposes. In recent years, the world has been changing so rapidly that it is impossible to predict whether there will be a direct military conflict between the US and China, or whether the Chinese yuan will take over the dollar. What do you think about the future world leaders? Write in the comments.